our panel is joining us as always. Both of these guests have been on the program before. She was a former State Department spokesperson and senior advisor to Secretary Kerry. Fox News contributor Marie Harf is back with us on the program, and he's a history professor over at the Hackley School in New York. Jared Fishman. Hello to both of you. Marie, Jared, how's everything?
Doing well.
Yeah.
We're doing well under the circumstances. The world feels like it's on fire, but hanging in there.
That is correct.
I'm happy to be here, of course.
Well, thank you for coming back on the program. I can think of no one better that kind of saw some of this up close and personal when you were at the State Department. So let me start with you first, Marie. Obviously, you worked there during the time when Russia annexed Crimea. Can you take us a little bit inside, what's happening right now in the State Department? Because, what we've seen, Nick and I were talking about this in the past segment, there's been so much misinformation, disinformation from the Russian side of this, but also Ukraine's making some claims of killing 6,000 soldiers. That can't be verified by news outlets. Can you just take us inside the process of what you went through in 2014, what the scramble drill kind of looks like inside the State Department, and then what you make of the overall conflict that's happening in the Russian invasion?
Yes. Well, I remember 2014 and 2015 very well. And I remember going to Kyiv with Secretary Kerry. The Maidan was still burning. The tires still, were on fire, basically. And I remember also going to Sochi, Russia, with Secretary Kerry when he met with Vladimir Putin. And so, there was a lot of diplomacy that we were working on in those days. And our goals at the time were, of course, to get a drawback of Russian forces. That's obviously what we wanted. We were not going to recognize the annexation of Crimea or the incursions into eastern Ukraine, but we really didn't want them to go further. And there were a lot of people involved in those talks at the time who felt like the sanctions that we did do, the steps that we did take, prevented them from, for example, trying to take Kyiv, which we thought was a real possibility in those years. And there are a lot of people who talk about Vladimir Putin that we negotiated with then and the Vladimir Putin of today. When we were in dealing with Ukrainians, they had gone through so much with their own uprising, with their own, trying to get towards the West and then being pulled back by Russia and by the Russian cronies, backed cronies in Ukraine. Ukraine is is different in many ways, right? Their democracy has settled down a little bit, not entirely, of course. They're not by any means a perfect democracy, but a lot of people feel like we see a different Putin today. And I'm not an expert on Vladimir Putin, but we assessed at the time that he was strategic. And I'm not going to armchair psychoanalyze him, but it feels today, looking from the outside, like he's a lot more detached from reality than even he was in 2015 and 2014. And the things that we are targeting now with sanctions hit at things he cares about, right? He deeply cares about a whole host of things, trivial and not trivial, right? He cares about Russian teams not being able to compete in FIFA games, right? And he also cares about the collapse of his economy. But it is unclear if he's getting any good information, any accurate information, and if he has an end game here. The last thing I'll say is that I have been really impressed with the way the conflict. They were basically declassifying intelligence in real time. They were putting out publicly what they thought Putin and the Russians were going to do. And that didn't stop the invasion, but I think it had to have affected his calculus. And that's very rare. I worked at the CIA too. They don't like doing that, certainly not in real time. So I think that we'll talk more, I'm sure, about the current situation and how it's been going. I think it's a really scary one in a lot of ways, in part because that Putin we were dealing with in 2014 that made a calculation not to go further, that Putin seems to be gone. And that I think is scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, we're just bringing this conversation into the classroom for where you are as an instructor, trying to take students through an understanding of how we got to this point and building off of what Marie had mentioned a moment ago about, this appears to be a different version of Vladimir Putin than who we globally experienced in 2014, 2013. What's your assessment of that? And just when you're addressing this with students, how do you put context to what we're seeing now, what we experienced globally back in 2013, 2014, and even prior to that with the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. It's a great question. Look, I mean, I'll be really honest. I do think that Vladimir Putin certainly is acting somewhat differently now, but this is not something that happened overnight. I mean, if we think about, why don't we start with Vladimir Putin's speech that he gave right before the invasion? I mean, he more or less said that his goal is to reconstitute the Soviet Union, and not in a communist sense, in the sense of power, right? So if we think about Vladimir Putin, let's just take a look. As a history teacher, like I focus on the long term, right? So I mean, look, he came to power in the late 90s. He attacked Georgia in 2008. He was fighting the Chechens. He did annex the Crimea in 2014, which was a foreign policy goal of the Russian state, literally back in the 1700s. So to me, a lot of this is not necessarily new. However, I think what is new is the fact that many people that I know, especially older folks in their 60s and 70s, who thought that they would never see a conventional war like we're seeing right now in the Ukraine, that is definitely something that is new, and it's a very, very bold strategy on Putin's part. So in terms of dealing with these issues with students, I always come at it from the perspective of facts. Just like I said last time I was on when we were talking about Israel and Palestine. What we've been trying to do at Hackley, and lots of other schools as well, what we've been trying to do is kind of talk to the students about the fears that they have, try to educate them about what we know about Russian foreign policy, what we know about Ukrainian foreign policy, what we know about the EU and NATO, and what we know about our own goals here in the United States. So we've been really trying to focus on those points. More specifically, we kind of, as a history department, kind of smelled this coming quite a while ago when Vladimir Putin started to move so many troops to the 3 different invasion points that Russian troops attacked the Ukraine from. You don't move 150,000 troops to borders as a chess move. I mean, it was pretty obvious that he was going to invade, and it was pretty obvious that he was going to invade after the Olympics were over, because obviously he doesn't want to upset the Chinese, right? And the other thing is the weather, right? Again, any student of history knows, like, if you're going to invade any country in that region of the world, it's got to be roughly now, because, if you wait a month, if you're into March, if you're into April, all of the mud is going to bog all those, Russian vehicles down. So again, we just addressed all of these different, concerns with the students. We held a round table about a month ago to kind of talk about the issues. And then me specifically, I have talked about, the invasion in my mainstream 9th grade classes, but the place that I've addressed it more than anything else is I do teach a specialized elective on war, in which, students will take this elective over the course of really 2 years. And we study the development of warfare all the way from Frederick the Great in the 1700s all the way into the modern world. So in a very sort of sinister way, the students are seeing all of the things that we've talked about sort of come to fruition, which again, for them is pretty scary, for young people to be experiencing something like this, even though in America, we're so far away from the actual events.
Yeah. Well, that's great to hear, by the way, Jared. And listen, as somebody who's graduated with you, I trust that you're teaching our students right. Marie, I want to get into, I have a few friends that are in Ukraine. I shared recently on social media an email exchange I had with a Ukrainian friend of mine because, I work in the sports technology space. A lot of tech firms are in Ukraine. And he texted me, hey, I can't really respond right now. Russia's invading us. I don't know if you know. And I was like, I know, Nick, good to see that he still had a sense of humor through all of that. But the big thing I've heard from a lot of Ukrainian friends of mine that have either lived in the country or, are here now in the US is they're not getting help in the form of soldiers, right? Germany, Portugal, Netherlands, Czech Republic, before you hopped on, I was mentioning about some of the countries that have committed to sending weapons. Who's going to man some of those weapons is what I'm hearing from Ukrainian friends. As this situation continues to be fluid with respect to the conflict itself, tough to do it in this type of podcast format as the situation continues to evolve. But where do you see a drop dead point where there is an absolute need for some type of military combat troop intervention from a neighboring country, somebody, an EU country, the U.S. itself? Where is that drop dead point as everything continues to escalate in the region?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges with Ukraine. I mean, I would say the drop dead point for the US is when a NATO country is threatened and when a NATO country is invaded. And we have an obligation to defend our NATO allies. I don't think that the world, and certainly the United States, has developed a good framework for how and when we intervene militarily in places we are not committed to through treaty alliances. And, we can talk about a number of cases in history where that's been the case. But I think so. So I don't foresee the United States sending troops to Ukraine. And I think there's a real question about what our national interests are in Ukraine. And there are certainly many, but how you weigh those against the possibility that doing so would be so escalatory that Putin, who has a huge arsenal, including a nuclear arsenal, could retaliate in a way that really spun this even worse than it already is. And so that's sort of a cold thing to say, but and I don't mean to sound that way. I want us to do everything we can to help Ukraine within those parameters. It doesn't help Ukraine to get all of Europe enveloped in a war because we've let it sort of spin out of control. And I think that, going back to my time at the State Department, that was always one of the challenges, because when you have a certain toolbox in diplomacy or in power, economic tools, diplomatic tools, military tools, and with a country like Ukraine that is not a treaty, that is not a part of NATO, those tools are somewhat limited. And the fact that Russia has so much power, particularly with energy resources in Europe, but other power as well, that also limits our tools, right? And so we don't have unlimited tools to take on Russian aggression. That's why I think what you've seen this week has been so extraordinary, just in the past, 5, 6, 7 days. Europeans, countries around the world, being willing to do things that 2 weeks ago they were not willing to do because the threat is so dire, willing to take steps that will cause them pain, sacrifice, that they were not willing to take 2 weeks ago. But it is a strategic question about whether the United States particularly, but sort of NATO countries more broadly, should be committing troops to a non-NATO country when that could escalate so quickly, so far. And that's a big step that I quite frankly don't think that the United States will take right now. And I'm not sure it should, candidly. And people calling for things like no-fly zones, armchair generals, calling for no-fly zones, or just shooting down some Russian planes or attacking the convoy. These things have a way of spiraling. And I think since 9/11, we have thought of war as something very different than this. We haven't thought of tanks and battalions. And that's, I think, partly, maybe what Jared was getting at, why this feels shocking right now, because, we think of war very differently in the world today. And this feels in many ways like a throwback to some of the things I'm sure Jared has spent his career studying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want me to jump in,
Please, yeah.
Again, I don't want to sound inflammatory here, but the second that you have American troops firing at Russian troops, that's really, as Julius Caesar would say, kind of like the die is cast. And I think I agree completely with Marie. That is something that I would surmise the US is going to try to avoid at all costs. And I think what's happening right now, look, the reason why 100 modern Russian tanks and God only knows how many BMPs and other mechanized troops have been destroyed is because of the fact that the western border of Ukraine is wide open right now. And as you said, Mike, at the beginning of when we first started talking, we and European nations have been shipping in anti-tank missiles and specific missiles like javelins and things like that to knock out Russian aircraft. So that's really right now the best short-term solution to try in terms of trying to help the Ukrainians fight the Russians. And it is, they've done exceedingly well at this point. As much damage as the Russians have done, their forces have stalled outside of not all of the major towns and cities, but at least sort of Kiev and Kharkiv up in the north. And here's the other thing to consider as well. The thing is, it's so dangerous, and I've heard many people say this. So many people have labeled Vladimir Putin as crazy. It is so dangerous to label him as that. The Russian government has been prepared for this for a very long time. Yes, the economic sanctions, in my opinion, are going to have a long-term effect on the Russians, but as of right now, it's more of a long-term kind of thing. So as long as that Western border stays open, we'll be able to kind of help the Ukrainians. The real question is, when will Putin close that border off? The tricky thing for the Russian army, Ukraine is a very big place. And as of right now, the Russians have probably 100,000 troops, maybe a bit more than that. They are not going to be able to hold the Ukraine with that many troops. Most military historians would argue that. So again, it's like Putin is kind of guiding this, right? So we know for a fact that he's reinforcing the troops that are there already. So it's just a matter of how much can the Russians logistically move their troops around the country, because they've struggled with that. They've struggled with fueling their troops. They've struggled with supplying their troops. So it's really, in a lot of ways, a guessing game. And again, Marie, you used the word armchair general before. That is something we have to be careful about, because ultimately all we can really do is take a look at the facts and make educated guesses. But if anything, Putin is very, very crafty.